Late-night city lights flickered in a rhythmic, staccato fashion through the windows of the nearly deserted bus, illuminating the worn-upholstered seats and the handful of passengers scattered throughout. The route snaked through the quieter districts of a sprawling metropolis, an urban sea of concrete, neon signs, and desolate intersections. At the very back of the bus sat Dwayne Johnson, his large frame attempting to find comfort in a space that seemed designed for someone half his size. He wore a nondescript gray hoodie, the hood partially covering a baseball cap pulled low over his face. Dark sunglasses concealed his eyes, although the hour was far past sunset. It was a deliberate choice. After a long week of personal obligations and public appearances, Dwayne didn't want to invite further attention. The bus provided a sense of anonymity he rarely experienced, and anonymity was precisely what he craved. Up front, near the driver's seat, sat Marty Davis, the bus driver. Marty's posture seemed to sag with the fatigue of someone who had been driving the same route for years. His short, graying hair and deeply lined brow suggested a lifetime of everyday struggles, of navigating roads under the bright sun and then hours more in the dim hush of night. The air inside was stale but held a trace of disinfectant, the type used to clean up the residue of 1,000 weary travelers. Overhead lights buzzed faintly, as if on their last bit of voltage. Dwayne could hear their drone blending with the low hum of the engine beneath his feet. A few seats ahead of him, close to the middle doors, sat a dignified, older black woman named Esther Martin, wrapped in a dark wool coat despite the moderate warmth. A patterned scarf, reminiscent of a classic tartan design, was draped neatly around her shoulders, and her fingers clutched a small leather purse in her lap. She exuded an air of composure, as though she'd seen enough of life to remain unshaken by much of what might come her way. At present, she spoke softly into her phone, a brief exchange in French that Dwayne's keen ears picked up. Her accent was gentle, lilting even, laced with an undercurrent of affection. Perhaps she was calling a granddaughter, a sibling, or a dear friend back home. From the melodic quality of her tone, one might guess that the conversation was both personal and comforting. Further up, near the front rows, a pair of young women huddled together under the soft glow of their phone screens, each wearing headphones. The faint tinny beat of pop music occasionally leaked out, only to fade again as the bus navigated a pothole or made a sharp turn. Another passenger, an older man named Alvin Reed, sporting a worn-out jacket, dozed intermittently by the window, his head bobbing in tandem with the bus's motion, as if lulled by its mechanical lullaby. Every so often he'd jerk awake, glance around in confusion, and then nod off again. Dwayne observed his surroundings in silence. Though imposing, he maintained a subdued demeanor, preferring to go unnoticed. Fame taught him that stepping into everyday life without fanfare was both a privilege and a challenge. There were times he longed just to blend into the crowd. Tonight, that was the goal: get from point A to point B with minimal fuss. He considered pulling out his phone to check messages or to pass the time, but decided against it. Instead, he allowed the monotony of the engine's hum to soothe him, thinking about how a simple bus ride could sometimes feel like a much-needed refuge. The hush inside the bus was abruptly fractured when it screeched to a stop at a dimly lit intersection. The hydraulic doors groaned as they parted, and 3 men climbed aboard. All 3 carried an air of belligerence, their voices raised in rowdy laughter before they even set foot on the vehicle. They wore leather jackets, each adorned with patches featuring skulls, flames, and cryptic insignias that might have been part of a biker club or some local gang. Their boots stomped on the grooved metal steps with a definitive clang, a self-conscious announcement of their arrival. Leading the trio was Chad Mercer, a tall, lanky figure whose greasy hair fell across his forehead in unruly strands. Behind him trailed Axel Grant, a barrel-chested man with coarse stubble that crawled across his chin, and Reaper Jones, the shortest of the 3, but with a wiry intensity in his eyes that suggested he was the most unpredictable. A half-empty bottle of cheap liquor dangled loosely from Chad's hand, in blatant disregard of the no drinking sign tacked up near the driver's seat. Marty Davis watched them in the overhead mirror, his lips tightening, but he chose not to say anything. If you'd driven a city bus long enough, you learned that certain confrontations weren't worth initiating unless absolutely necessary. The men laughed raucously, exchanging crude comments about whatever bar they had just left, slapping each other on the shoulders as though they were celebrating some unsavory victory. The presence of these newcomers was like a cold gust of wind, chilling the previously tranquil atmosphere. Dwayne Johnson, seated all the way in the back, shifted his gaze slightly, his posture relaxing even further in a studied sort of calm that belied his heightened awareness. He'd been around enough troublemakers in his life, both in and out of the public eye, to recognize the shift in the air when men like these walked in. They carried themselves with the casual arrogance of individuals who believed no one would or could challenge them. Instead of finding seats, Chad and Axel leaned on opposite poles near the front, while Reaper hovered close to the middle doors. They radiated a sense of territorialism, as if they already owned this portion of the bus. The smell of stale beer and unwashed leather wafted toward the rest of the passengers. Marty's eyes darted from the road to the mirror, checking for signs of immediate trouble, but he kept both hands on the wheel. The other passengers exchanged uneasy glances or resolutely stared out the windows, hoping to remain invisible. Esther Martin appeared unperturbed at first. She continued her soft conversation in French, though her free hand clutched her purse a little tighter. Across from her, Alvin Reed blinked awake, momentarily startled by the noise, but quickly sank deeper into his seat, trying to avoid their notice. The two young women near the front turned down their music, exchanging apprehensive looks. One quietly removed her headphones, anticipating that events might escalate. "That's what I'm talking about, boys," Chad crowed, sipping from his liquor bottle. "We got ourselves a party bus." His words were laced with intoxicated sarcasm. Axel let out a guttural laugh, tapping his foot on the floor in a rhythmic, almost mocking pattern. Reaper, for his part, scanned the passengers one by one, seemingly hunting for any sign of submission or challenge. Dwayne kept his head low, the brim of his baseball cap shielding his eyes. His shoulders tensed under the hoodie, but he forced them to relax. He had no intention of playing hero. Not yet, anyway. In his experience, bullies tended to feed on fear, seeking it out like predators. He hoped they'd grow bored and leave everyone alone, but a knot of concern formed in his gut as he noticed Reaper's gaze linger on Esther Martin, who was still speaking softly into her phone. When people like this trio locked on to someone, trouble often followed. As if on cue, Reaper nudged Chad with an elbow and gestured subtly toward Esther. Chad's attention snapped to her, and in that instant, Dwayne felt the mental alarm bells go off. The older woman, who exuded such composed dignity, had unknowingly drawn their interest simply by having a phone conversation in a language that they didn't recognize. Chad's lip curled into a mean-spirited smirk. He took a swig from the bottle, wiped his mouth with the back of his hand, and squared his shoulders as he prepared to move. "Hey, lady," he called out, voice slurring from the alcohol. "What kind of gibberish you speaking over there?" His tone was loud, intentionally disruptive. Esther paused her call, turning her head just enough to acknowledge him. She offered no immediate response, but the look in her eyes was one of mild annoyance rather than fear. She seemed poised, as if in her many years she had encountered this sort of confrontation before. Reaper snickered, stepping closer to Chad. Axel hovered near them, crossing his arms over his broad chest. Each of the three men seemed to feed off the other's hostility, forming a tight nucleus of aggression. "You hear me?" Chad demanded, taking another step toward Esther. The movement caused the rest of the bus riders to tense up. Marty, from the driver's seat, glanced back again. The bus rolled on, but with a subdued hush that suggested something was about to happen. Esther took her time ending the call. She spoke a few final words in French, a gentle farewell, then set her phone in her purse. When she finally looked at Chad, her posture remained impeccable, her back straight against the seat. "I was speaking French," she answered, her tone measured. "I'm from New Orleans, originally, but my family has deep French roots." There was calm steel in her gaze, as though she refused to be intimidated by a drunken ruffian. "French, huh?" Chad sneered. "Last I checked, you're on an American bus, speaking some foreign crap. Maybe you should do that back home, Grandma." His words oozed contempt, laced with a brand of insecurity that masked itself as belligerence. Esther's mouth formed a tight line, but she said nothing in response. Her silence only seemed to embolden him. "What, you think you're better than us 'cause you talk fancy?" he pressed, voice rising enough to bounce off the tinted windows. Across from them, Alvin Reed let out a strained cough, turning his face away as if wishing to become invisible. The two young women had their phone cameras subtly angled, presumably recording the encounter. They exchanged whispers, uncertain whether to intervene or stay silent. Dwayne's jaw clenched behind his hood. He had a front-row view from the back of the bus, and everything in his posture signaled that he was carefully calculating whether to step in. Esther, however, remained admirably composed. "I do not believe I am better than you, young man," she said, enunciating each word with quiet firmness. "But I also do not tolerate rudeness." Her eyes flicked over the three men, her expression tinged with a mixture of indignation and pity. "You should respect your elders," she added. Her statement triggered an aggressive ripple in the group. Axel let out a sharp bark of laughter. Reaper snorted, running his tongue across the front of his teeth as if tasting blood. Chad took another gulp from the bottle, then smashed it against the seat, shattering the glass near the metal pole. The action sent tiny shards skittering across the aisle. A collective gasp spread through the bus. "Respect?" Chad scoffed, brandishing the broken bottleneck like an improvised dagger. "I don't owe you a damn thing." Dwayne's eyes narrowed behind his sunglasses. He inched forward on his seat, quietly sliding a foot into the aisle. He could sense the men's intoxication fueling their belligerence. This was no idle posturing anymore. Chad had a weapon, albeit a crude one, and was standing mere feet away from Esther. Marty, the driver, coughed into the overhead speaker, his voice quavering. "Fellas, there's no need for trouble. I'll have to call the cops if—" He didn't finish because Chad snapped his head around with a menacing glare. "You keep your mouth shut if you know what's good for you," Chad spat, waving the jagged bottle in a half-threat, half-warning. Marty shrank back in his seat, pressing his lips together tightly. The next stop wasn't for several more blocks. Even if he tried to pull over, it was uncertain these three men would let him do so calmly. Axel stepped forward, joining Chad's intimidation stance. He wore a battered leather jacket adorned with an iron cross on one sleeve. His knuckles were scarred and bruised, as though he'd frequently found himself in brawls. "Look at her," Axel muttered, flicking his gaze dismissively at Esther. "All high and mighty, talking in foreign tongues." "Makes me sick," Reaper, shorter but with a rat-like wariness, stood slightly behind them, occasionally glancing around as if expecting a reaction from someone else on the bus. His posture suggested a readiness to pounce if the situation escalated further. Esther's expression flickered with a momentary trace of alarm, but she quickly regained her composure. The tension now charged the air like static before a storm. Alvin near the window looked almost paralyzed, his eyes moving from the men to Esther, then back again. The two young women huddled closer, one of them silently trembling. Dwayne noticed that at least one of them was still recording with her phone, presumably uploading or live streaming the footage. He silently willed them to keep a safe distance. Chad's chest puffed out, feeding off the fear. He stared down at Esther with a twisted grin. "How about you show a little respect for us, old lady?" he sneered, tapping the broken glass bottle against the back of a seat. "Kiss my boots, maybe. Say you're sorry for—" He never finished. The bus hit a small bump, jolting everyone, and in that moment Chad stumbled closer to Esther with the broken bottle. Dwayne's instincts flared. He knew intimidation could easily morph into violence, especially when cornered men were buoyed by alcohol. He rose from his seat, letting the hoodie fall back just enough to free up his arms. His sudden movement drew Reaper's attention. The shorter man frowned, as though he'd only just realized there was another significant presence aboard. "Who the hell are you?" Reaper barked, stepping sideways to block Dwayne's path. Dwayne said nothing initially. His towering form alone spoke volumes. While he wasn't as tall as Chad, his muscular build was unmistakable, and his posture radiated a readiness that was the polar opposite of drunken bravado. Through the tinted lenses of his sunglasses, he measured Reaper. The man's stance, the subtle shaking in his limbs, the acrid smell of stale beer and underlying fear. It told Dwayne everything he needed to know. Chad turned his attention to Dwayne as well, brandishing the broken bottle like a weapon. You got a problem with us, pal? His voice was thick with liquid courage. Axel let out a low chuckle, but it was half-hearted. Something about Dwayne's calm presence unsettled him. Even so, men like them rarely back down without a fight, especially in front of each other. They thrived on twisted notions of respect. I don't have a problem, Dwayne said finally, his voice surprisingly soft. Unless you keep threatening that woman. It was a clear warning. Tension ratcheted up another notch, so palpable it felt like a physical presence on the bus. Outside, the city slipped by. Shadowed buildings, flickering street lamps, and closed shops with their security grates firmly in place. But inside, the drama played out in a space that felt increasingly claustrophobic. Reaper swung his gaze back and forth, trying to decide whether to be intimidated or antagonistic. His pride won out. He gave a short bark of laughter. Oh, look at this! Mr. Hoodie thinks he's a tough guy. Chad spat on the floor, wiping his mouth again with the back of his hand. We'll show him tough, Chad muttered, knuckles whitening around the broken bottle. Dwayne stepped fully into the aisle, placing himself between Esther and the three bikers. She used the moment to rise from her seat, clutching her purse close. Though she'd been stoic, she was no fool. The menacing trio posed a real threat. Her eyes flicked toward Dwayne in a silent plea. Whether for caution or gratitude, he couldn't be sure. In a measured voice that carried a weight of experience, she said, There's no need for violence. This can end now if you stop. Chad barked a laugh, a harsh, mocking sound. You hear that, boys? Granny wants to call a truce, and this big guy here thinks he's going to boss us around. He brandished the jagged glass again, pointing it toward Dwayne's chest. We do what we want, old lady, he snarled. And you, he jerked his chin at Dwayne. You better step aside or you'll end up like her phone. Reaper cracked his knuckles, shifting his stance as if preparing to lunge. Axel remained a step behind them, an almost animalistic grin creeping across his face. The three formed a hostile semicircle, each fueling the other's aggression. The rest of the bus held its collective breath. No one dared move. Alvin, awakened to full alertness by the confrontation, silently mouthed something that looked like, "Oh God," or "help." The two young women were now half standing, clinging to the overhead bars, their phones capturing every second of the escalating standoff. Outside, the bus rumbled through a forlorn stretch of road. Buildings gave way to empty lots strewn with debris, a place where streetlights were sparse. If anything were to go terribly wrong, it felt as though no one would even notice from the outside. Marty's voice crackled over the speaker again, shaky but resolute. I'm calling the police, he announced. Just so you know. Axel turned his head and sneered in Marty's direction. Call 'em. We'll be long gone before they show up, and you'll be picking up the pieces here. There was a distinct madness in his tone, the unmistakable arrogance of someone who believed they could do whatever they liked. Dwayne took a single step closer to Chad, ignoring Reaper's attempt to flank him. The big man loomed, and in that moment, the tension snapped like an overstretched wire. Chad lunged, brandishing the bottle in a broad, sloppy arc meant to slice across Dwayne's midsection. The act was fueled more by adrenaline than skill. Dwayne anticipated the telegraphed movement, pivoting his torso just enough that the glass whooshed by harmlessly. He seized Chad's wrist with a lightning reflex honed from years of training and twisted until the bottle fell from the biker's grasp. Chad howled in pain, veins bulging in his neck, and tried to slam a punch into Dwayne's side with his free hand. Dwayne caught that too, absorbing the blow with his forearm. Without ceremony, he propelled Chad backward, sending the lanky man crashing against a seat. The older occupant of that seat hastily scrambled away, eyes wide in terror. Axel, seeing Chad go down, snarled and charged in next, fists swinging in a crude flurry. Dwayne pivoted with surprising agility for his size. He deflected the strikes with his forearms, each impact jarring but controllable. Meanwhile, Reaper circled behind, attempting to catch Dwayne off guard. A swift elbow from Dwayne collided with Axel's gut, causing him to double over with a grunt. But Reaper seized the opening and lunged, aiming a wild punch at the back of Dwayne's head. In the reflection of the tinted window, Dwayne caught the movement just in time. He ducked, spinning to the side. The momentum caused Reaper to stumble forward into an empty seat. Like a coiled spring, Dwayne seized Reaper by the back of his collar, yanked him upright, and delivered a crushing jab to his midsection. The blow knocked the wind out of Reaper, leaving him gasping and disoriented. Chad, momentarily forgotten, recovered enough to launch himself from the seat where he'd been thrown. He lunged for Dwayne, aiming to tackle him around the waist. But Dwayne was ready. He sidestepped the charge, hooking one powerful arm around Chad's torso. In a display of raw strength, he lifted the lanky biker clear off his feet, pivoted, and slammed him against the floor of the bus. The thud resonated through the metal frame, eliciting shocked cries from the onlookers. Chad's head lolled for a moment, a groan escaping his lips. Nearby, Axel was regaining his breath, while Reaper still clutched his ribs and coughed. Sensing the precariousness of their situation, Axel tried to rally. "You bastard," he growled, attempting to muster a second wind. He glared at Dwayne, whose stance remained measured, feet set, shoulders squared, ready to continue the fight if necessary. The bus ride, once a silent retreat from city chaos, had turned into a war zone. Debris from the shattered bottle crunched underfoot. At the front, Marty kept glancing at them in the mirror, one hand tightly gripping the steering wheel. He saw no safe place to pull over, and his primary objective had shifted to reaching the next major stop where the police might be waiting. Esther stood off to the side, pressed close to an empty seat for support. Her gaze darted around, assessing the aftermath of every blow. Though her expression was laced with concern, there was also a quiet determination in her features, as if deep down she believed in some cosmic justice that had placed Dwayne here at precisely this moment. Reaper straightened up, eyes flicking to the seat of the bus, where a metal rod used to hold the protective partition was loosely attached. Sensing a possible advantage, he lunged for it, tearing the rod free with a metallic screech. He brandished it like a makeshift club. Axel grunted in acknowledgement, as if they both realized this might be their last shot to come out on top. Dwayne pivoted on his heels, scanning the environment. His mind worked fast. The narrow aisles limited how many angles they could attack from, but a metal rod could be dangerous in such tight quarters. "You don't know who you're messing with," Reaper spat, gripping the rod. "We'll leave you in a heap, hero." Dwayne exhaled. "Enough," he said in a low, resonant tone that cut through the bus's stale air. "You had your chance to back off." Axel feinted left while Reaper lunged from the right, swinging the rod in a downward strike aimed at Dwayne's shoulder. The strike was hard and swift, but Dwayne managed to block with his forearm. Pain jarred him. Metal meeting flesh was never pleasant, but adrenaline and his physical conditioning allowed him to power through. Without missing a beat, he seized the rod near Reaper's hands, twisting violently to rip it from the smaller man's grasp. Reaper's eyes flared with panic as he was disarmed. A quick elbow from Dwayne slammed into Reaper's jaw. Reaper staggered, dazed, and collapsed onto a seat, moaning in pain. Axel, taking advantage of Dwayne's focus on Reaper, moved in close to land a direct punch to Dwayne's kidney area. The blow connected, forcing a grunt from Dwayne as he felt a bolt of pain radiate through his side. But Dwayne responded immediately, pivoting to deliver a short, explosive uppercut that caught Axel under the chin, sending him stumbling back. Another swift strike to the sternum forced Axel to double over, gasping for air. Chad, who had been sprawled on the floor, crawled to his feet again, blood trickling from a cut on his forehead. He eyed Dwayne with a mixture of rage and fear. For a moment it seemed as though he might charge again, but the sight of Axel hunched over, Reaper slumped in a seat, and the distinct advantage Dwayne held made him hesitate. His body shook from a combination of adrenaline and alcohol. The entire confrontation, from the moment Chad smashed the bottle to this tense standoff, had spanned mere minutes. Yet to the onlookers, it felt like an eternity. The bus continued on its route, nearing a more populated area. Faint city lights flickered through the windows, revealing deserted storefronts and closed businesses. The police, if summoned promptly, might meet them soon, but for now the riders remained hostages to the tension in the aisle. Esther watched with a haunted steadiness. Dwayne caught her eye momentarily, noting the faint sheen of tears that threatened to form. She clutched the scarf at her neck, but her posture never lost its dignity. Alvin, trembling, pressed himself against the window, breathing in shallow, shaky intervals. The two young women appeared torn between fear and awe. Their phone cameras still pointed in Dwayne's direction, capturing every punch, every dodge, every heated glare. Chad wavered on his feet, swaying slightly. Despite his battered condition, anger burned in his eyes, an anger that overshadowed reason. "I'm not finished," he growled. He lunged forward with a desperate punch aimed at Dwayne's ribcage. Reflex kicked in once more. Dwayne sidestepped, hooking Chad's arm. With a firm twist, he forced Chad's momentum forward, slamming him headfirst into the seatback. The impact was jarring, and Chad went limp, sliding to the floor in a dazed heap. Axel tried one last time to rejoin the fight, letting out a guttural roar as he mustered the energy to swing at Dwayne. But the blow was wild, lacking precision. Dwayne met him with a short jab that connected solidly with his jaw, snapping Axel's head back. The bigger man stumbled, tripped over Chad's legs, and crashed into the seat across from Reaper, who had just begun to straighten himself. The two bikers ended up in a tangled pile, their battered bodies heaving from exertion. In the stunned aftermath, the bus was eerily silent. Broken glass from Chad's bottle glinted in the overhead fluorescent lights. Tiny shards scattered around the seats. Blood smeared across the aisle from split lips and cut foreheads. A low moan escaped one of the men, but no further threats were issued. They were spent, thoroughly outmatched. Even Marty seemed temporarily speechless, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. Dwayne scanned the scene, chest rising and falling from the exertion, though his voice, when he spoke, remained calm. "It's over," he announced, not so much to the bikers, but to the entire bus, as if granting permission for everyone to breathe again. Hesitantly, the passengers stirred. Alvin exhaled a breath he'd been holding, then nodded shakily at Dwayne in silent gratitude. One of the young women lowered her phone, her eyes wide. "That was... oh my God," she whispered, sounding both stunned and relieved. Her friend still had the camera trained on the aftermath, but tears clung to her lashes. Esther, unwavering, stepped out from behind her seat, meeting Dwayne's gaze. "Thank you," she said softly, each syllable carrying profound depth. In her voice was a mixture of relief, gratitude, and possibly even sadness that such a confrontation had been necessary. She approached the groaning Chad, watching him with an air of regret rather than triumph, then turned back to Dwayne. "These are lost men," she added quietly, "but that does not excuse what they did." Nodding, Dwayne acknowledged her words. "I just couldn't watch," he replied. It was a simple statement, but it conveyed everything he felt about stepping in. He hadn't planned to become the bus's guardian. He had boarded only wanting solitude, but he was the type who couldn't stand by while an innocent person was threatened. Marty's voice crackled again over the intercom. "I see flashing lights ahead," he said, relief saturating each word. "Police must be waiting at the next stop. Hang tight, folks." The tension released in small increments. Passengers moved in tentative shifts, collecting their belongings or sliding closer to the windows to see if the squad cars were indeed visible. The battered bikers remained in disarray on the floor and seats, nursing injuries that had clearly doused their bravado. Chad mumbled something incoherent, possibly a curse, but there was no real fight left in him. Dwayne took a second to catch his breath, then gently set the improvised metal rod, which he had wrenched from Reaper, on the floor, far from the biker's reach. With the immediate danger neutralized, a wave of introspection hit him. He glanced at his hoodie, torn at the sleeve, and felt a dull ache radiating from his side. Axel's punch had connected solidly. He also noticed the rawness across his knuckles from blocking, grabbing, and striking. None of that mattered much right now, though. What mattered was that the men had been stopped before they inflicted serious harm on Esther or anyone else. Esther drew closer. Dwayne noticed that the older woman was trembling, despite her outward composure. When she spoke, her voice still held that refined elegance, but there was a slight tremor beneath it. "Are you hurt?" she asked, looking him up and down as though to verify any injuries. Dwayne shook his head. "I'll be fine," he replied, offering a reassuring, if brief, smile. He was more concerned about whether the confrontation had left her shaken. She must have seen the question in his eyes because she gently touched his forearm and nodded. I'm, I'm all right, thanks to you, she said. I've encountered bullies in my lifetime, but rarely have I seen someone put them down so quickly. There was an underlying sadness in her tone, as if she were simultaneously relieved and weary at the need for such force. Dwayne had encountered that kind of sadness before, in places where aggression was the norm, and those oppressed simply accepted it until someone intervened. Sometimes words aren't enough, Dwayne muttered, glancing at the battered men. They had every chance to walk away. Alvin, the older man by the window, cleared his throat, drawing attention. His voice was unsteady but resolute. I just want to say thank you too, he said. I couldn't have, well, I wouldn't have known how to stop them if they turned on me. One of the young women chimed in, voice still quivering. Yeah, that was incredible, man. You saved all of us. Her friend nodded vigorously, wiping away tears with the back of her hand. A pang of self-consciousness washed over Dwayne. This was precisely the type of spotlight he avoided, especially in everyday life. But he also knew that deflecting these thanks would do no good, so he offered a polite nod and a quiet, "You're welcome." Meanwhile, the next stop drew closer. Marty slowed the bus to an idle, flicking on the hazard lights. Through the windshield, two squad cars sat parked under a flickering street lamp, their red and blue lights casting dancing shadows. Esther looked outside, then turned back to Dwayne. "You may want to stay and give a statement," she suggested. But Dwayne shook his head, the hood of his sweatshirt shifting slightly. He knew from past experience how complicated it could be once authorities arrived, especially for someone of his public stature. "I think they'll figure it out without me," he said gently. "There are plenty of witnesses, and those men aren't going anywhere." A slight smile curved Esther's lips. She seemed to understand that some heroic acts were best done without lingering for applause. The bus hissed as it came to a complete stop, the doors swishing open. Two uniformed officers approached, their flashlights cutting through the shadows on the asphalt. One stepped up to the driver's window to speak to Marty, while the other began climbing aboard to survey the damage. Dwayne exhaled slowly. It was time to go. The officer stepping onto the bus was tall, with a neatly trimmed mustache and a watchful gaze. His badge glinted under the fluorescent interior lights. He did a quick sweep of the scene, taking in the three battered bikers, the shattered glass, and the expressions of relief mingled with shock on the passengers' faces. Marty was standing halfway out of his seat, gesticulating as he explained the situation. "Those three got on, caused trouble, attacked a lady," he said, pointing. "That big guy in the back, was in the back. He defended everyone." Alvin leaned into the aisle, nodding eagerly. "He sure did," he added. "Took them down like they were nothing." Esther remained composed, arms folded over her purse, her eyes flicking toward the rear of the bus in search of Dwayne. But the seat was empty. At some point in the final seconds before the officer boarded, Dwayne had slipped away with quiet efficiency. She suspected he was already stepping off through the open doors at the back. The policeman furrowed his brow. "Where is he now?" he asked, scanning the length of the bus. Alvin shrugged, raising empty hands in a gesture that conveyed ignorance. The older man's expression was tinged with admiration for Dwayne's well-timed exit. "He's gone, officer." Outside, Dwayne moved swiftly down the sidewalk, keeping close to the shadows. The night air felt cooler than before, as though some cosmic relief had settled over the city. He paused around the corner of a deserted convenience store, adjusting his cap and sunglasses. In the distance, he could hear muffled voices, the crackle of police radios, and the subdued hum of the bus's engine. He inhaled deeply, letting the surge of adrenaline subside. A hint of pain throbbed in his side, reminding him that the fight hadn't been entirely one-sided. Back on the bus, the officer radioed for medical assistance. Chad and Axel were too dazed to resist as they were pulled to their feet, handcuffed, and lined up near the front. Reaper tried to protest, muttering about how they were the victims. But his complaint devolved into a slurred ramble. The second officer, an older woman with a calm, no-nonsense demeanor, listened to Marty, Esther, and Alvin as they detailed the sequence of events. The two young women offered their phone recordings, eager to show the entire confrontation as evidence. By the time paramedics arrived to assess the injuries, the story was effectively sealed. The three men had initiated violence, and a mystery defender had intervened to protect the passengers. Some of the younger riders hopped off the bus, phones in hand, presumably to continue filming or to see if they could spot Dwayne. But by then, the street was empty aside from a dim street lamp flickering ominously. No sign remained of the broad-shouldered man in the gray hoodie who had subdued three attackers without hesitation. A swirl of excitement and confusion rose among the small crowd that had gathered. Whispers about the man's identity buzzed like bees. Could he have been a local boxing champion? An off-duty soldier? Or maybe, just maybe, a certain celebrity who often wore a hoodie and cap to remain incognito? Esther stepped off the bus as well, carefully picking her way around the shards of glass. She stood on the sidewalk, the city lights casting a faint glow over her dark coat. For a moment, she considered if she should try to find the man who had protected her, but intuition told her he had come and gone like a passing guardian, uninterested in thanks or recognition. She murmured a quiet prayer of gratitude, both for her own safety and for the mysterious stranger who had stepped in when no one else would. Inside the bus, the police continued their routine, methodically gathering statements and evidence. Eventually, paramedics loaded Chad, Axel, and Reaper into ambulances. The entire fiasco would likely become a local news tidbit. Late-night bus. Brawl ends with thugs hospitalized. Mystery hero disappears. The older policeman walked the aisle, verifying the safety of the passengers. Some had resumed their seats, eyes still wide, while others remained near the front, eager to get off and distance themselves from the troubling memory. Several blocks away, Dwayne paused in front of a closed bakery, the smell of yeast and flour still faintly emanating from the inside. He glanced over his shoulder, half expecting to see flashing lights. Instead, he was met by the hush of an empty sidewalk and the sporadic whir of a passing car. He reminded himself to check his side for bruising later, an old habit from years of athletic training. Another day, another set of bruises, he thought with ironic amusement. His mind lingered on the older woman's stoic expression. She had shown remarkable courage in standing up to verbal abuse despite her vulnerability in age and the physical difference between her and the bikers. In many ways, it was her unwavering dignity that had prompted him to act, no matter the potential fallout. The quiet fire in her eyes reminded him of individuals he had encountered throughout his life. People who might have been victims, yet refused to be defined by fear. He took out his phone and briefly considered calling someone to pick him up. Then he checked the time, just past midnight. He decided he could walk the remaining distance to his destination. The night air would do him good, help him unwind. With each step, he replayed the fight in his mind, diagnosing the moves like a post-match analysis. He hoped that, by leaving, he spared Esther and the others a complicated round of questions about who he was and why he felt compelled to intervene. At a crosswalk, he caught sight of his reflection in the glass front of a shuttered cafe. The hoodie was ripped at the elbow, and faint streaks of dirt marred his cap and jacket. He took off the sunglasses, massaging the bridge of his nose. For the first time, he noticed small nicks on his knuckles. The scuffle, though brief, had been intense enough to leave tangible reminders. He inhaled a steadying breath, then exhaled slowly. Cars drifted by intermittently, a low rumble echoing through the near-empty streets. Dwayne wondered whether the video footage captured by the two young women would go viral on social media. In an age where everything is posted online, it was possible that, by morning, the world would see him flipping drunk bikers around on a city bus. He shrugged inwardly. If that happened, so be it. He hadn't acted for fame or applause. He'd acted because it was right. As the traffic light turned green, he continued on, weaving through a quieter neighborhood. Rows of modest houses appeared, their porch lights casting warm halos in the darkness. A cat skittered across the sidewalk in front of him, and somewhere off in the distance, a dog barked. The city never truly slept, but it had moments of soft tranquility like this, where even the chaos of a street fight could feel worlds away. A flicker of movement drew his attention. An elderly couple sat on their porch a half block ahead, rocking in mismatched chairs. likely oblivious to the drama that had unfolded on the bus. He imagined how different people's nights were, some facing confrontation, others enjoying routine relaxation. Life carried on in 1,000 parallel lines. The memory of Esther's unwavering gaze returned to him. People like her faced bigotry and aggression daily, yet continued with dignity intact. Maybe his role, ephemeral as it was, served as a small counterweight against that tide of hostility. Dwayne realized he was close to a major thoroughfare that would lead to his lodging. City lights glimmered in the distance, forming a mosaic of neon signs, tall buildings, and the after-hours crowd milling about. He was ready to retire for the evening, but part of him felt the electric current of an unresolved feeling, like a story that needed closure. For now, though, the best closure he could imagine was a hot shower and a good night's sleep. Tomorrow would come soon enough. Back on the bus, the police officer with the mustache was concluding his inspection. He questioned Alvin Reed, who recounted the entire ordeal with nervous energy. "Yes, sir. They boarded at the last stop, started picking on Miss Martin there," Alvin said, gesturing to Esther. "Then that big fellow in the hoodie got up and took 'em out like they weighed nothing." The officer scratched notes into a small pad, occasionally shaking his head at the vivid descriptions. It was rare in his experience to hear of someone single-handedly subduing 3 dangerous men without a single bystander getting hurt. Esther, for her part, only spoke when asked direct questions. She affirmed that the 3 bikers had provoked the altercation and that she had feared for her safety. When the officer pressed her about the identity of the mysterious benefactor, she politely shrugged, offering only, "I don't know his name. He didn't say much, just stepped in when the men attacked." She declined to speculate further, a protective glint in her eye. She had a feeling that if Dwayne wanted recognition, he would have stayed. The paramedics finished checking the bikers, who grumbled bitterly, too bruised and sore to maintain their swagger. One paramedic muttered that at least 2 of them might have fractured ribs. The cops read the men their rights as they were half dragged off the bus. One tried to protest that they were the ones who had been assaulted, but no one took his plea seriously. The moment the men had brandished a broken bottle and threatened an elderly passenger, the moral ledger had tipped decisively out of their favor. Moments later, the bus was allowed to continue on its route, though half its passengers decided to walk or catch a taxi from that well-lit intersection. They'd had enough excitement for one night. Marty exhaled, wiping sweat from his brow, and offered to skip any more stops for those who remained, just to get them to their destinations faster. Esther opted to stay on the bus, as she lived a few more stops down the line. Before the bus lurched into motion again, she gazed out the window, scanning the shadows for any sign of Dwayne. Of course, he was nowhere to be seen. A wave of reflection washed over her. While relieved to be unhurt, she pondered the turn of events, the cruelty that had erupted so suddenly, and the swift, decisive intervention that had saved her from further harm. She thought about prejudice, about bullies who saw a single older black woman as an easy target. She also thought about the capacity for good that lay dormant in quiet strangers. Somewhere in the city's underlit streets, Dwayne Johnson was walking away from conflict with no expectation of a reward or even a formal thank you. The notion stirred a tender gratitude in Esther's heart. Marty turned in his seat to address the remaining passengers, voice shaking from lingering nerves. "If any of you need to file a report or anything, we can wait for another set of officers at the end of the line," he offered. Alvin, the older man near the window, patted Marty's shoulder. "I think we're good," he said, his tone holding relief. "Let's just get home, yeah?" Thus the bus rolled onward, broken glass crunching underfoot, tension still palpable in the stale air. But there was also a sense of collective release, as though the danger had passed and they had endured. Quiet conversations started up here and there, and every so often, the name Dwayne or that big guy floated among the whispered accounts. The incident would become local lore, the silent protector who vanished into the night after averting a small tragedy. Dwayne eventually reached the place where he was staying, a modest, unassuming apartment building that provided short-term rentals. Inside the narrow lobby, a single overhead light buzzed softly. He took the old elevator to the 4th floor and fished out his key. Upon entering his unit, he let the door close behind him with a soft thud. The sense of stepping into his own sanctuary was immediate. Despite its simplicity, a tidy living area, a compact kitchenette, and a small bedroom. It was safe, quiet, and disconnected from the chaos of the wider city. Slipping off his torn hoodie, he tossed it over the back of a chair. The movement made him wince. Axel's punch had definitely left its mark. In the fluorescent glow of the apartment's overhead lighting, he saw a dark bruise forming near his rib cage. He sighed, removing his cap and sunglasses, setting them gently on the counter. In the mirror above the kitchenette sink, he noted a light cut on his cheek, likely from a stray shard of glass or an unanticipated scuffle. Nothing serious. His phone buzzed with a notification. For a moment, he braced himself, half expecting to see some viral clip of the bus incident already. But it was just a message from a friend, reminding him about an early morning meeting next week. Sighing again, he scrolled briefly through social media. Nothing yet about a heroic bus fight. Perhaps it would surface later, or perhaps not at all. Either outcome was fine by him. He headed into the bathroom, letting hot water run in the shower. Steam quickly filled the small space, fogging the mirror and providing a comforting haze that seemed to wash away the tension of the night. As he stood under the spray, warm rivulets cascaded down his shoulders, each drop loosening the taut muscles that had bunched up in anticipation of conflict. The memory of the bikers, the broken bottle, Esther's calm resolve, and the hush that had overtaken the bus came back to him in fragments. He couldn't say for certain whether those men would learn a lesson from tonight or merely nurse their bruised egos and come back angrier. All he knew was that, for one moment, he had intervened in a cycle of cruelty that might have otherwise spiraled out of control. After the shower, he wrapped a towel around his waist and retrieved a small first aid kit from the kitchen cupboard. He dabbed antiseptic on the cut on his cheek, wincing slightly at the sting. Then he used the reflection in the microwave door to check for any other scrapes. Satisfied he wasn't seriously injured, he changed into comfortable clothes and sank into the apartment's worn armchair. In the corner stood a small lamp casting a warm, diffused glow, offering a gentle contrast to the harsh overhead lights of the bus. He closed his eyes, letting the ambiance soothe him. His thoughts drifted to Esther Martin, the resolute older woman who had stood her ground against ignorance and intimidation. He hoped she was home by now, perhaps with her family on the other end of that phone call, recounting the bizarre events of the night. For all her grace, she had endured an indignity that no one should have to face, yet she had not cowered. People like her, Dwayne mused, carried the world forward in quiet acts of resilience. Eventually, fatigue weighed on him. Tomorrow held new tasks and obligations. The city, as ever, would keep moving, weaving new stories in the labyrinth of its streets. Perhaps tonight's confrontation would become a fleeting anecdote overshadowed by tomorrow's headlines. Or maybe it would ripple outward, reminding a few watchers that even a single, decisive act could shift the balance between cruelty and compassion. Closing his eyes, Dwayne allowed himself a final reflection, that in a world so often fueled by fear, one moment of courage could illuminate the darkness, if only for a short time. Outside, the nocturnal rhythm continued uninterrupted. Cars passed, horns occasionally broke the silence, and the faint hum of late-night radio chatter wafted through half-open windows. But inside that modest apartment, Dwayne Johnson slipped into a well-deserved sleep, unburdened by second thoughts about his role on the bus. He had done what needed to be done, then walked away without seeking fanfare. That, he realized, was enough.